All right, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all today. Thank you for joining us for today's AI and Medtech webinar. I'm Ryan Nolan, Director of Reimbursement, Value Generation, and Market Access at PRIA Healthcare, a full-service reimbursement consulting firm helping companies from early ideation stage all the way through on patient access and commercialization. I'm joined today by my three esteemed panel members, and do one of you guys want to kick things off? Take a moment and provide a little bit of an introduction on who you are and a little bit about your background.
Sure. I'd be happy to kick off. Hi, everyone. I'm Stacey Stevens. Really happy to be here today with the other great panelists to talk about this really exciting area of healthcare. By way of quick background, I've spent my entire career in the medical technology space, earlier on the devices side with Philips Healthcare, in a number of different commercial roles and executive leadership positions in marketing and strategy. I went on from there to one of the early AI companies in healthcare in the breast imaging space called iCAD, where I stayed for 17 years and ultimately ran that company as president and then CEO for a few years. Where we launched some of the earliest AI technology in healthcare to the market in the breast imaging space. And then I formed my own strategic advisory company called Elevate a couple of years ago, and we've been working with companies in the AI space with a special focus on women's health in bringing scientific breakthroughs to the market. And most recently, for the past several months, I have been serving as CEO for a really exciting company called Symbiosis, that is a pioneering tech bio company building the world's first digital precision medicine platform that will serve clinicians and patients with technology and innovation in AI and spatial biophysics along every stage of the cancer journey. So super excited about that and super happy to be here with you all.
Thank you, Stacey.
Mm-hmm.
David, do you want to go next?
Sure, great. Yeah, good afternoon, or I guess good morning to everyone. My name is David Giese, or you might see John David Giese, but I usually go by my middle name. So my background is in biomedical engineering, and I actually, in undergrad, did a research rotation in breast cancer AI, like computer-aided detection of breast cancer. Anyway, after graduate school, I started analytics with my co-founder, Yujan Shrestha, and we've grown the firm, and I'd say to date, we've helped somewhere around 70 companies develop the software for their medical devices, as well as get it FDA cleared, with a heavy focus, especially in the last 5 years, on AI-enabled devices. So I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Laurel.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining today. I want to preface this by saying that I don't think PRIA went out specifically to get ex-Philips people, but it turns out that Stacey and I used to work together, and we haven't seen each other for a long time, so it's nice to reconnect on this webinar. But like her, I spent most of my career in Medtech, where I worked for HP, Agilent, and then Philips, and I was a state and federal lobbyist, and then moved to market access and reimbursement when it became clear that these were key areas that were starting to affect our product. So in 2018, I was running the global market access group. I left Philips and started my own company, and I've focused specifically on areas around telehealth, digital health, and certainly AI, and particularly related to imaging, since that is my background with Philips. I also have been serving on the digital medicine payment advisory group with the AMA for about 6 years now. And so this is the AMA advisory group that looks at coding gaps for particularly digital health. So things like the remote monitoring codes and remote therapeutic monitoring codes. And then I also have the privilege of serving as a trustee for a hospital system where I chair the finance committee. So that's really been an interesting journey to really understand that side of the equation when people think about value from that provider's perspective. So, and I've been doing that for about 4 years.
Excellent. All right, so to kick things off, I want to first just sort of orient everyone. The goal of today's panel will be to explore two main topics. One, how the regulatory landscape has changed and best practices for engaging with FDA early. And then 2, how to best approach clinical evidence for providers and financial stakeholders to adopt your technology. So before we dive right into questions, I wanted to kind of take a moment just to quickly set a common foundational understanding, and then we'll transition over to discussing the regulatory side of the equation. So to begin with, artificial intelligence has rapidly transformed the landscape of medical devices, as probably many in our audience. And this is really reshaping how healthcare is delivered and experienced by patients, providers, and financial stakeholders like hospitals and payers. Over the last decade, advancements in machine learning, data analytics, and computational power have enabled medical devices to move beyond static functionality to become more dynamic tools that enhance decision-making, personalized care, and improve outcomes. So what does this really mean? Well, for patients, AI-powered medical devices have the ability to enable earlier detection of diseases, tailored treatment plans, and continuous monitoring, fostering proactive rather than reactive care. For providers, the benefit from AI's ability is to analyze vast data sets, identify patterns and streamline workflows, reducing diagnostic errors and freeing providers to focus on patient care. And then lastly, for the financial stakeholders like hospital systems and payers, these innovations drive value by optimizing resource utilization and reducing unnecessary procedures, thereby improving cost efficiency across the healthcare system. So as the integration of AI into medical devices continues to develop, simply put, its potential to bridge gaps in access, equity, and precision will only deepen. So let's start with the first topic. Over the last 10 years, the FDA has done a lot to provide better guidance for and engagement with medtech companies through programs like Q-subs or pre-subs and recent software as a medical device and AI guidance. So let's start off, maybe David, if I could ask you the first question. In your experience, how has this improved device development and authorization processes?
Certainly, yeah. So I do think in the imaging space, some of the guidance, especially a few of them that came out in 2022, really clarified FDA's expectations for submissions and clinical validation. And I think what we've kind of seen is usually sometimes with one pre-sub, maybe 2 pre-subs, we can get a very clear vision around how FDA is expecting us to demonstrate the clinical performance of the devices. There's still certainly ambiguity in areas and in side cases, but I think FDA is really doing a good job, in my opinion, of keeping industry updated. And even beyond the guidance, a few of the AI best practice guidelines, they're not like official guidance, are also quite useful, and they're publishing papers and so on. So I'm impressed with FDA's engagement.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the work that the FDA has put into the topic of software as a medical device has really benefited AI companies from the standpoint of it's really bringing more predictability to the regulatory process, especially for small companies, right, who may not have the experience of dealing with the agency. And what it allows companies to do that are in the AI space is really design products with compliance in mind, right? So you have this information up front. And I think it allows for much greater communication between the companies and the FDA. So I would, having personally gone through recently a Q-sub meeting with the FDA, I would highly encourage the use of that opportunity, because you can really have some deep discussions about what your plans are to develop the software, gain alignment on the endpoints for clinical studies, really gain alignment on the clinical trial protocol, right? These are all things that if you can get agreement up front, you can eliminate the bottlenecks that you sometimes can run into and ensure yourself a much smoother, process to go through in a more timely approval. I will tell you that I've been around AI since AI was a thing in healthcare, and I think that the approvals are coming faster. The company that I lead right now, Symbiosis, we just got our second FDA 510K clearance, and we got it in 25 days. I think that the reason we're able to do that was really having good communication up front, having a very high quality submission, and all the documentation was very pristine. So I think the FDA is setting us up for success with a lot of these guidance, and the benefit of that to companies is that we'll be able to get our innovation cleared and to the market faster than we would have in the past.
Thank you, Stacey. I think that's an excellent point. And along those lines, Laurel, if I could pick on you for a second, what are your thoughts around engagement with FDA early and some of the other programs that beyond just Q-subs and pre-subs, maybe the early payer feedback program or things like that, in your experience? What are your thoughts of when to engage on those, and any tips or tricks?
Well, I would just, engage early is sort of the two words that you should always remember, not only with the FDA, but also with payers. If reimbursement is important, separate reimbursement for your AI product, it's really it's important to understand upfront that pathway, because first of all, your claims are going to be important in terms of what are you claiming and how does this map to reimbursement. The second thing is, what evidence are you going to need for reimbursement? That's where the FDA's early payer feedback program, for example, can be very helpful. This is done at the pre-sub level. So you're able to engage payers very early on to get feedback from them about the types of evidence that they're going to want. Because I always like to remind people that while 510K clearance gives you access to the market, whether the market will adopt it or pay for it is going to be different types of evidence beyond safety and efficacy. Payers consider FDA clearance or approval sort of the bottom line or the foundation, but it's certainly not going to drive adoption or reimbursement. And so really understanding those evidence requirements really early is really important. And again, I just also want to make sure that, just to reiterate the issue around claims and what are you claiming for your product? If it's a predicate product, what's the reimbursement pathways for those products? Because even in AI, it's not that different from Medtech. You still have to be able to fit somewhere in the reimbursement pathway, or if not, you're going to have to go and create your own pathways, and your claims are going to be really important in that. So.
Very well said.
If I could jump in, I would say for people who are considering doing pre-subs for AI-enabled devices, there's definitely some strategy in as far as when you do it and what information you include in the pre-subs. And one thing that I would say that maybe sometimes surprises company is that if you're thinking about designing a clinical validation protocol, we really suggest providing quite a bit of detail on how your models work. And in fact, we have a pretty systematic process with set diagrams explaining how the reference standard is developed, the different data sets involved in training and validation, also how you're testing kind of non-machine learning components in the processing pipeline. And we found that by providing a lot of that information, especially in a diagrammatic kind of consistent format, it enables FDA to provide more useful advice on your clinical study design. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what both Laurel and David are saying. And I think engaging early for sure, but also engaging very strategically, right? And really understanding, do you have enough information ready to be able to file a Q-sub, right? Because you're going to get asked these questions in quite a bit of detail. And I think it's really important to understand what competency you have in the company and engage help if you need it, right? There are experts in this field who have been dealing with the FDA for a very long time, right? And you will get very detailed questions. Having just participated in a Q-sub a couple of weeks ago, you will get very detailed questions. And, my company had done 2 or 3 dry runs, right, of the presentation, timing it to the minute and making sure that we had meticulous detail around any potential question that could be asked, to David's point, right? So, but we wouldn't have known that if we hadn't engaged some help, to really understand how to anticipate what kinds of questions we might get and really how to prepare. So I think you have to really have a regulatory strategy in place, know who's leading that, know what help you need, and also don't underestimate the documentation, right? The documentation has to be meticulous, right? It's a reflection of the quality of your products, right? So if you have a typo or one miscalculation or something is misaligned, it sounds silly, right? But it reflects on how you're developing products. So I think you have to really pay close attention to the documentation.
I also just wanted to add, and I'm sure David or Stacey could add more to this, but because we're talking about AI, we're talking about an algorithm. So the question is, what's the data sets that went into building that algorithm? And, I mentioned that I'm a trustee at a hospital. We're a safety net hospital. We serve a lot of underserved populations. I've had conversations with payers, and I know the FDA is also thinking about the equity issue. And so when you think about what populations you're representing in your algorithm, this to me is one of the biggest challenges to think about. Is it going to be a trustworthy algorithm in the end, where I, as a physician or another provider, can make a trustworthy decision on clinical care based on that algorithm? And I feel like the FDA is really ramping that up quite a bit. And I'll let David speak to that, but it's something to really think about, because I've worked with people before and they tell me, well, the data sets were really small. And honestly, I don't think that's going to be sufficient anymore. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think FDA is really consistently pushing on this, and there's a few rules of thumb. Some of these probably a lot of people know, but you want to have 50% of your validation data in the U.S. You usually need 3 distinct sites that can depend on the specifics, and you usually need to cover the different ethnic groups. You don't necessarily have to. You don't need to power the ethnic groups, like in your subgroup analysis. You don't need to have them statistically powered, but you do need to show the FDA, like, hey, we're covering our bases here. One other real quick thing I would say is there's a difference between statistically powering your study and then proving generalizability. And those are 2 different things. And often you'll need more data to show generalizability than just statistically powering your study. So that's something we've seen a number of companies run into, where they feel like, hey, our study is statistically powered, but that's not good enough because they weren't able to show or convince FDA that the results would generalize across different subgroups.
Right, and also thinking about, just from a payer's perspective, the clinical significance of that, because you may, for example, one payer gave me an example of if someone can walk 50 feet and your product can make them walk 100, that might be statistically really significant, but clinically it isn't. So you really have to think about sort of that whole package when you go to market, especially with something like AI, where people are going to want to understand how this is going to make a difference along the care pathway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this whole issue of data bias and ethical issues is a very big one. And I agree with David. The FDA is really looking at this a lot more closely, because what we don't want to do is develop AI tools that are designed to have better outcomes for patients and have that only be applicable to certain populations of patients. And we don't want to exacerbate health equity issues in any way, right? And there are differences in how these tools can be used among different populations of patients. It's not a one size fits all, right? And certain disease states like breast cancer, for example, certain populations of women are much more, have a much higher death rate, for example, younger African-American women, right? So we don't want to design tools that actually exacerbate some of the challenges that already exist in healthcare today. So I think really thinking about your data that you're putting into these products and thinking about it up front and presenting that to the FDA up front and getting alignment on that, again, is something that they're really honing in on right now.
Yeah, I mentioned predicate things before. I think maybe I'm jumping ahead, Ryan, to one of your questions, but when Stacey mentioned that, I just wanted to remind everyone of what happened with some of the early facial recognition AI that came out that was being used by police departments around the country, and the data sets were built on primarily white faces. And so it was making a lot of mistakes, and it created a lot of distrust with those algorithms. A lot of them stopped using them. There's a lot of focus on algorithmic justice right now. And so I do think, especially in healthcare, with all of the focus on equity right now, and importantly so, that this is an issue that we really have to take seriously. So.
Yeah, I think you used a really important word, Laurel, which is trust, right? And I think that is so critical when you're a company marketing an AI solution. You really have to be sure to gain the trust of your clinical users up front, right? Because it's hard enough to sell AI solutions into healthcare today with some of the challenges around labor shortages and where healthcare dollars are being diverted. And I think you have to make sure that whoever you're selling it to, you can gain their trust in that algorithm as soon as possible. And sometimes it takes time, right? It might take a number of months before, to use an example, a radiologist, right, might trust your algorithm, to work in conjunction with them to find cancer earlier and faster, right? And I think you have to be patient and have the resources in place to answer questions that come up early on, and make sure that you really do secure that trust, because that's the only way that your AI algorithm is going to become standard of care, right? Is if ultimately they have the trust that it's been developed well and it will work well on all their patients.
Yeah, so I think this is a good sort of transition point over into more of the financial stakeholders' receptivity to some of these technologies. If I could just pose a question to all three of you with regards to hospital systems or payers, perceptions and receptions of medtech. How have you seen this change in the last 10 years as AI's continued to grow in the way that, as we just talked about, the FDA is increasingly providing better and better guidance and engagement with medtech companies?
Well, I can just speak to having been in the radiology or imaging business. When AI first came out, there was a lot of concern that this is going to replace me, that they're not going to, that they're not going to need me as much. And I think that has, just like any sort of new technology, people get a little concerned that somebody's out of their swim lane and they're in mine. So, but I do feel like that's changing. I mean, if you look at how the AMA characterizes augmented intelligence as opposed to artificial intelligence, there was a lot of rationale behind that. But one of the big ones is that this is augmenting a clinician, it's not replacing them. And so I feel like there's growing acceptance towards using that as part of clinical practice. If you're interested, you could go on the AMA website, and they've done some recent surveys of physicians and looking at different ways that physicians are using artificial intelligence, primarily in the sort of operational end. Understand for billing, coding, that kind of thing, it's probably more widely accepted. And on the clinical side, it's always back to that trustworthiness issue, and the ability to get it paid for too is the other issue for some AI. So those parts are evolving, and we're probably not as far as we would like to be, but we are seeing more and more providers adopt AI solutions as part of their clinical toolbox. But more than we were. And outside of while imaging, I think, has the most, in terms of AI applications, we're seeing a lot more in cardiology, neurology, certainly in behavioral health, we're seeing more of that. So, and that kind of tracks with the digital and telehealth solutions as well, because many of these solutions have AI components to them.
Yeah, I agree. If you look back 10 years ago and to where we are today, it's like night and day. I think even in the last 5 years, it's changed dramatically. And I think that's because, 10 years ago, AI was still being perceived as sort of a futuristic concept, right? And it wasn't really clear what the value propositions were from a clinical and economic standpoint. And then with the explosion, in the last 10 years, and particularly in the last 5 years of AI tools, with clearly radiology is way ahead of the curve of any other discipline. I think around 80% or more of the AI tools that have been approved by the FDA are in the radiology realm. And I remember back to the company that I was working at the time when we were introducing the world's first AI software for 3D mammography, we did run into a little bit of that, what Laurel was referring to, like skepticism of, will this replace me, right? And that was never what it was intended to do, and never how any of the companies marketed it. It was always meant to assist radiologists in detecting more cancer, lowering false positives, reducing reading time. But I think now all of that is very much embraced, right? And that's come with the development of these really strong value propositions and proof points that we can improve clinical outcomes, we can drive cost savings, we can drive efficiency. And that's why you see a lot of the generative AI tools are really being adopted now too, because they can really prove time savings. And with the shortage of resources in healthcare across so many disciplines right now, I think that we have to embrace AI as a way of, accomplishing what we need to do. I think there's big demographic issues too that are impacting that, right? We have the aging population, the rise in chronic disease. For the first time ever, we're going to see 2 million patients diagnosed with cancer in 2024. We just have to embrace technology and all this data that we have access to as a way of sort of augmenting our capacity for care. So I think all these things are coming together, to drive greater acceptance and more, embracing the technology as a way to solve some of these critical healthcare problems.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that Stacey, you're absolutely right to think about a lot of it is need driving the need for, we have a shortage of specialists, we have a shortage of primary care physicians. One of the first states to adopt telehealth was Mississippi because they had whole parishes with no doctors. And during COVID, this was even exacerbated by people not being able to go in. And so I think, as people are being asked to do more with less, and as conditions in spaces where it's very complicated, some of those imaging technologies they take a long time to read, it's hard to look at. So any of these types of AI products are much more prevalent now and more accepted, but most of it's been driven by the need. We always ask, what's the clinical problem you're trying to solve? And is it big enough for someone to want to pay for? And the payers are asking the same thing. Is it of strategic importance to me and my plan and my members? And do I want to pay for it? So.
Yeah, along those lines with payers, if I could pull on that thread, how in Laurel and Stacey, in your experience with them, how have payers approached use of AI-driven diagnostics, and what have been the biggest arguments against AI, like that our webinar attendees might take away to help plan now for those types of arguments?
Well, I think a big part of it is the value proposition and value demonstration. It's like any other device. Do you have evidence to show that it's making a difference in clinical outcomes, in economic value? Can you integrate it into clinical workflows? Those are all questions payers are asking. So you might have a really cool technology and an interesting AI algorithm, but the big question is the evidence issue. And I don't want to minimize that, because there are a lot of companies out there with very interesting solutions, but the evidence has yet to follow. So to ask a payer to pay for something that's unproven is going to be a problem. The second one is, what type of AI is it? The CPT panel and the AMA developed a taxonomy around AI. So is it assistive? Is it autonomous? Is it, augmentative? So really looking at where does it fit in that framework? Because for a lot of assistive AI, which is basically doing something better that they're already paid for, payers typically view that as software. They're going to integrate it, that should be integrated into the base code. They're asking the question, why should I pay more for something I'm already paying for? So if you have an AI algorithm that's assistive, for example, a CAD product that is looking at an image that can detect something better than the naked eye can do, that's valuable, but it's not necessarily something that's going to be paid for separately, as opposed to some of the augmentative AI products that are, for example, looking at white lesions in MS patients and able to recognize something that you can't see with a regular image. Heart flow is a good example. They were looking at FFR calculation. You can't do that by, and that's not being paid for by the cardiac CT code. So those are the kind of products that are actually starting, and they have, good evidence that they're able to support separate reimbursement. And in that case, I think that a lot of the commercial payers are paying for them. Medicare is coming along. Some of it is just there's no specific benefit category, so they're trying to figure out what's the mechanisms to pay for these things. But there are like new tech APCs. There's examples of Viz AI being paid in the hospital as an add-on payment. So there's different mechanisms that they are using to pay for it. But if you step back and ask why are they paying for it, I'm going to tell you it's because they have the evidence to support that.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I think the answer to how payers are approaching reimbursement for AI tools is very cautiously, right? They are very cautious about it. And we're seeing the pace of innovation move a lot faster than the pace of reimbursement for these tools, right? And I think that's evidenced by, we have around 1,000 AI tools cleared by the FDA, and there's probably less than 10, right, that have code. And even getting a code doesn't get you all the way where you need to be, right? You can have a code, but not have coverage or payment, right? And it, there's still a lot of work to do, right? Once you get a code, you can't claim victory, right? Then you have to go and convince the payers to cover it and to get a value, right, that will be attractive to the customers that you're selling to. So I think it's been very cautious, and hopefully it will pick up, because this is a big obstacle to companies that are selling these tools into the marketplace, right? Now, again, with capital budgets being so stretched and being used to deployed at covering the resource shortages, it can be really hard to get the dollars for these tools prioritized. And that's why I think you're seeing the market in AI move from what used to be sort of a hardware-based model. You would sell a piece of hardware with a software license, to now a lot of these solutions are all going to the cloud, and the business model selling to customers is more as a software as a service model, so that they can pay monthly a much smaller amount, as opposed to buying it all up front and trying to compete with a lot of other technology and the capital budgets. But there are some tools that have been successful, and to Laurel's point, it's because they can prove that they can do things that maybe humans can't, and they have such a robust body of clinical data that it's hard to argue that they can't change the standard of care very effectively. But it's a rough road, and like I said about dealing with the FDA, I think it's important to get support here from companies that can support you through that coding process. It's complex. And another thing that hasn't been brought up yet is the importance of society alignment, right? So whatever area of medicine you're dealing with, getting alignment with the society that represents you very early is critical. They're going to be speaking on your behalf, they're going to support it or not, and their voice is loud, right? So I think gaining that alignment early on can really help speed up the process when you're trying to obtain a code.
Yeah, and having said that too, especially with imaging, but other types of AI too, understanding who the financial stakeholder is in all of this. So for example, in an imaging AI, you might have a sort of a nodule detection, which would be a pulmonologist, or you have a cardiology application. The cardiologist plays a key role in that, but the stakeholder is the radiologist. So you have to map who are the societies that are going to support or not support you in your pathway to reimbursement, and understanding who that financial stakeholder is and who the person that is really using the AI versus who's ordering it. So I think it's important to understand both of those. And also, we have to think outside of the box here in terms of, Stacey mentioned software as a service. Commercial payers have the ability, they're not necessarily tied to traditional fee-for-service payment pathways. There are a lot of payers, a lot of the blues that are paying as a per member per month or software as a service. They can create their own billing code, and it's not necessarily a one-for-one. Also, there are many sort of integrated delivery networks who have programs like pulmonary nodule clinics or other types of things where the AI plays a key role in managing those patients within it. And so reimbursement isn't necessarily feasible or even necessary to drive adoption. There's a lot of AI companies that are being very successful selling into these organizations without fee-for-service reimbursement.
Excellent. Yeah.
I just jump in and say I don't have a whole lot to add except to echo the experience that a lot of our clients are getting stuck. Like they get through the FDA, we help them kind of get there, and then they get stuck in this in the reimbursement spot. Also, I was just going to ask really quick, Stacey or Laurel, for startups who want to start talking with societies to get society alignment early on, do you have any advice on how you would go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, it's really working your way to them through your customers, right? So, presumably companies that are starting out have developed some early KOLs that are working on the development of the tool and being, sort of a voice of the customer feedback into the company. And often they may be these very people that are running the societies, but if not, often they can make an introduction and connect you to the head of the society. But I think it's important if you can, early on in the development of your product, engage the head of the respective society. That's going to put you a mile ahead of the game, right? But I think it is possible through customer relationships to get to that person.
And most societies, the big ones at least, have reimbursement people on staff. They also all have meetings and presenting and doing poster sessions, that kind of thing can get people excited about it. I agree with Stacey, finding influential people within the society to connect you, and also understanding the politics of the society. When you think about the ACR, for example, their first primary concern with reimbursement is to protect the base codes, to protect the payments for CT and MR and PET. And in a budget neutral situation, if you add more payments, you're going to recalculate that pie. So there is concern about erosion of the base codes. So understanding sort of what their concerns are really important to also inform your go-to-market strategy and whether you're going to be able to get society support for that.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of jump onto that, Laurel, too, to summarize what I'm hearing from you guys, it's really about the clinical utility data that's going to convince the financial stakeholder, the clinical societies to support you, the payers to pay for if they're, that traditional reimbursement fee for service, or even, some of the blues plans that you had mentioned, Laurel. They're all going to want to see clinical utility data, not just the analytical and clinical validity data that I think a lot of companies focus on up to submitting with the FDA, and then coming to the other side and realizing I need to generate more. So David, I just wanted to kind of ask you, because you're very close to the early development of these machine learning diagnostics, as well as supporting companies through engagement and submission with FDA. Are you seeing that companies are starting to pick up on this? 10 years ago versus today, that they're thinking about clinical utility data, or is this still something that maybe a broader education is warranted for a lot of the medtech entrepreneurs out there?
Yeah, I don't believe that many people are thinking about it as early as they should. And I would say one of the challenges is a lot of times the clinical validity studies are done with retrospective data, at least for a lot of the diagnostic devices. And so it kind of limits your ability to use that same data for the clinical outcome. But I wouldn't say like we have seen some cases where they have been able to do that, but it's definitely harder. So sometimes it may be like, hey, we know we're going to need to do that, but it just makes sense to do it as a separate study. But if you can do it together, obviously thinking about it earlier.
Yeah, I think it's important because you're right. A lot of the data sets are built on retrospective data, but what the payers want is prospective data. And it's so it's a combination. If you're a diagnostic or you're helping diagnose something, the clinical validity is very important. So that's a foundation. But then understanding how it's used in the care pathway requires prospective studies of clinical utility, and understanding how is this going to be used in practice. And economic data is also important. How is this going to impact my bottom line as a payer or provider? to understand that. In the US, we don't use QALYs. We don't have an agreed upon threshold. So economic data becomes a little bit in the eye of the beholder, but talking to payers up front, like through the early payer feedback program and others, can help you understand what kind of things are important. Is it reduction in biopsies or invasive procedures? Do I even care about that? In some cases, they don't. It depends on the situation. Is it avoiding emergency room visits or other kinds of things that you could do by using the AI? You're, for example, keeping someone out of the hospital, which is the most expensive place of care. So understanding sort of those economic drivers and building them into your trials is as important too as the clinical utility piece of it.
Yeah, I think that's true too from a commercial standpoint, right? It used to be many years ago, the sale of AI was very much a clinical departmental sale, right? And let's just say your call point back then, would have been a radiologist, right? That has really changed over time, and it's very hard to go in to sell AI if you have just a clinical value proposition, no matter how good it is, right? No matter if you can claim that you can detect X% more cancer or reduce false positives, as an example. A lot of times there are more stakeholders involved in the choice of acquiring an AI solution in a hospital. So now you have big influence from a chief information officer, right? Because this AI, we have to figure out how to connect it within the health system, right? What PACS is it going to run on, et cetera? How do, workflow is a really important component as well. And a lot of these health systems are looking for the ROI. They're looking to understand the economic value proposition in addition to the clinical one. So you have to be armed with understanding what that is. So for example, if you're building an AI that can, predict which patients may be afflicted with a particular disease state, right? You have to be able to carry that through to what's the economic impact of getting those patients treated earlier versus later on when the disease has developed, right? So, I think you have to be able to go in to these types of commercial situations with data specific to that particular health system, right? Really understanding, the financial status of that health system, the number of treatments that they're doing in different, realms of healthcare, and really tailor a solution, but understand that it's going to be hard to just sell it to the clinician. There's a lot more people involved in the decision on that sale than there ever has been.
Yeah, I know in our hospital, we, the departments put together their departmental level budget. They might put their wish list together, but it rolls up to a central budget, which is, where when resources are limited, as most hospitals are, you're going to pick and choose where you're going to spend your money. And so it's like, what is the need to have versus the nice to have, and what can we afford this year? And so, so understanding how that process works within each individual hospital or customer is going to be important because that's going to tailor your value messages. And like Stacey said, having some economic data, calculator is sometimes helpful, other kinds of ways, because hospitals also believe their own data, not somebody else's. So, so allowing the hospital to provide input into what their needs are and what their cost drivers are, and providing them with a tool to figure that out with your product is going to be really helpful.
I can't, to the comments, Stacey, that you made, I really echo as one, interrupting the workflow and understanding what the radiologists want out of the workflow is a big deal. Like we've seen a number of clients where, because the FDA wants to have the radiologist editing annotations to reduce the risk of it, they want to create their own user interface for that. But then now the radiologist has to learn a new tool, and they're not going to do it. And that's just a showstopper once they try to start selling it. So they satisfy the FDA, but then they make their life harder. And then the other thing is with the cloud deployments versus on-prem deployments, and understanding the trade-offs and all the IT things there. We help our clients with a lot of that, and it can really be a big pain. There's a lot of trade-offs that you're making. So anyway.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you raise a really good point, David. Really bringing in, having resources in the company that can go in, even in the pre-sales process, right, to really pan the whole IT landscape and understand the workflow, what environment you're going to be connecting into. Oftentimes there are, major IT and cybersecurity questionnaires now that you need to fill out, and they can be very lengthy and take a lot of resource to complete them. So doing that all up front. Otherwise, if you wait until after you've convinced the customer of a sale, it could take you months and months to actually end up implementing the solution because you're just starting then to understand the environment you're going into.
Yeah, I would also say that just from a payer's perspective, don't discount that issue, because if they want to cover something, that data privacy and security is a big issue for them as part of the coverage decision. So evidence that you can do that, keep that data secure, because they're liable too. And so they're going to be concerned about that. And then the other issue is, yeah, they're liable to that. And then the other issue is, can it integrate easily into the existing clinical workflow? Because it's a lot of work to cover something. It's not just say, oh yes, they have to review all the evidence, they have to put it in, they have to change their systems, they have to do a lot, and they want to make sure people will use it. So it's really important to understand how that will work.
That's really interesting, Laurel, what you're saying about the payers considering cybersecurity. That's not something I've thought about or before, but it makes a lot of sense, because what I'm often seeing is the companies focus on the FDA cybersecurity requirements, which as of 2023 are much higher. But even then, the buyers in the IT department's requirements, they're a different stakeholder. They have different perspectives, and sometimes you can get past the FDA, but then you start to try to sell it, and some of those software architecture decisions you made early on really kind of constrain you later. So definitely thinking about those stakeholders up front as best you can, again, help avoid
it's
pain.
Interesting how the FDA, the provider, and the payer, there are some differences in what they think about, but there's a lot of similarities and a lot of overlap into that.
Okay. Well, we've got 12 more minutes on the call. I want to kind of take a break. I hate to interrupt this great conversation, but I want to open up to everybody. If you see the Q&A at the top, if you click on that and you have any questions, please feel free to post those there. We do have one that came in, and I'll just read it to you guys. Feel free to jump on it. To what extent have you seen black box effect being an issue in integrating AI algorithms in clinical workflows, especially in cancer care? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
I would ask to clarify what they mean by black box effect. If they just mean that there's no visibility into what the, I guess I'm not familiar with that term actually, black box effect.
Yeah, I would probably need more clarification around that question. Perhaps whoever asked it could just type in a little more information so that we're answering the question appropriately.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the question is referring to lack of sort of explainability in the algorithm, or if the black box term is being used a different way.
Yeah, because that's what I was
like in regards to
is like, can you explain who went into the data, what went into the building the algorithm? Because there's been a lot of discussion about who's responsible for that. Is it the if something goes wrong? There was some legislation pending for a while that I know there was a lot of pushback on, but around the actual industry being responsible, or the doctor being responsible, which is not going to go over well with the AMA. So it's this issue of accountability and liability into the trustworthiness of the algorithm is a big issue. And so if that's what they're talking about, it's sort of a work in progress. I would suggest that people follow the policies around that, because it's sort of heating up in that area.
Yeah. They responded again saying in regards to explainability. So
I think that's it, right? And I think this is an ongoing challenge for the FDA, because many of these algorithms lack transparency and explainability, and that makes it hard for the FDA to predict the behavior of the model, right? So, for example, if you have a cancer detection algorithm, understanding like why exactly did that algorithm mark something as cancer, right? So I think that's an ongoing issue, and that can be a little bit of a bottleneck potentially in terms of FDA clearance. But I think we're going to see a lot more innovation in this area, where actually companies will come to market, with algorithms that do have that explainability and transparency built into them, and we'll be able to communicate that more. But I think we're still on the early end of that.
one comment I could add on the topic of explainability is we often, as an engineer, you're often trying to have a more end-to-end algorithm that gets you as far as you can in one go. But we often are advising our clients to kind of focus down what the model does. So for example, like if you have a segmentation model that's segmenting an MRI, you can then explain to FD, you can do performance evaluation on the segmentation instead of on the final computer-aided detection. And then there's usually some post-processing steps that are more transparent and easily explained, like, hey, if the volume of these annotations are this, then it makes the level of evidence you need lower than if you just had the model go all the way to the end in one go. So I don't know if that's helpful, but
No, and I think also this issue of equity is going to be part of this whole explainability issue. How do I know? I've had payers say, how do I know if I have a 65-year-old white woman and a 35-year-old black male that I'm going to get the same results? And so this is going to be, I think, built into some of the FDA requirements for algorithms, and it's certainly questions that payers ask and providers.
Yep. All right. For another question, if we were to futurecast, what challenges do you foresee with regards to adaptive and continuous learning AI systems?
Sure. So one comment I would make is FDA is actually today, and I think today and tomorrow, has a generative AI advisory board summit. My partner Yujon's attending, and they published a paper prior to that. And one of the comments they made was that they actually have not yet cleared any continuous learning models, which was a bit of a surprise to me. We hadn't worked on one, but out of those 1,000 devices that are cleared or granted, or none of them have unlocked weights. Again, and that's as of a FDA paper they published last month. So I find that surprising. Certainly the PCCP plans allow you to kind of get to how quickly you're retraining to that interval a lot faster, but it's still not like doing it like continuous learning like you might see in some other industries. Hopefully I'm answering the question, but yeah, my guess is like it's a risk benefit trade-off. It's like what is the benefit of having those weights be updated so frequently, like such that it outweighs the risks of not doing validation, or perhaps risking overfitting to the validation if you're rechecking against it so frequently. So I'm not sure what situations you would get such a big benefit. So, and my suspicion is that's not going to be a really common thing. And in a lot of cases, having the real-time training is just not that useful compared to maybe like a monthly updates, or maybe per hospital updates within a PCCP plan.
Well, just putting a provider hat on, or even a payer, when you think about continuous learning or things that the algorithm is changing or adapting as you're learning, when are you done? Like, at what point is it good or not? I mean, and how might it change so that the way I looked at it originally to approve it or adopt it is going to be different based on new data that's coming in. So to me, that's kind of a broad, but I feel like that's going to be an issue. You know, if you have a fixed, you can say, okay, it does this and this is how it works. When you start to change it and adapt it, which could be a good thing, but then it's also creates that challenge of when is it done, you know, or when's good enough where I can then adopt it if it's going to change as it gets more data.
Yeah, and I think the current regulatory processes, you know, and models are just weren't designed for ongoing updates, right? And so those would have to be rethought. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, with the FDA adapting to a lot of the rise of AI in the last 10 years, do you guys have thoughts as far as like receptivity for the other stakeholders, like hospital systems being willing to adopt and integrate a technology that's continuously learning, or how payers might perceive it? I imagine, like just the adoption of AI in general, that the hospital systems and the payers may follow the FDA's pioneering, as it were. But what's everybody's opinion on that? Tough question.
Like, that's a tough question. I
Yeah.
think it's back to what I was saying. It's like, is the algorithm trustworthy? And why is it continuously? I look back in the technology industry. I mean, Stacey and I have been in the medtech industry. A cardiograph does look nothing like it did today that it did 50 years ago. Things are always continuous, and the medical device world has always been iterative, in that we're constantly making updates and things. But it depends on what those updates were, whether you need to go back and resubmit claims around what you're doing or what it can be used for. Think about cardiac CT, for example. With the advent of 64 slice and above CT, suddenly you were able to do cardiac images much more quickly, which were much clinically better. And so some of the coverage policies are specific to that latest version of a CT. So I think about algorithms like this as they iterate and get better. Is it going to be different types of claims that are able to associate with it? I don't know the answer to that, but I feel like that's something that we haven't really thought about when we think about software as a medical device, and sort of the iterative nature in general of medical devices.
Yeah, no, I think that's a well phrased response.
I was just gonna say, it wouldn't surprise me if hospitals and perhaps even the FDA start to want more kind of continuous validation of the model. So not where you're retraining it, but where you're checking the results in some ongoing fashion. And I think FDA has kind of hinted they would like to move more in that direction, especially with generative AI enabled devices. But that's a little different, I think, than what you're asking about.
Don't you think too it has something to do with what the AI is claiming to do as well? Because if you're looking and you're being able to see something better or do something better, that's a little different than you're actually changing a diagnosis and a treatment plan for a cancer patient, for example.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got like 2 minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and try to recap for everybody on the call, kind of some of the main takeaways that we discussed today. A lot of content, but just quick running through things. Some of the main points to emphasize for everybody on the line: engage with the FDA early on, as well as the clinical societies, and get payer input through programs like the Early Payer Feedback Program. Don't forget to address clinical utility in your clinical evidence. It's going to be key, especially on the back end of your market launch, and really kind of consider how this is going to change the standard of care. And then lastly, consider early, who's the financial stakeholder in the equation for your technology, not just how is it going to be used, as this will affect your clinical endpoints necessary to really convince those stakeholders. Anything I missed?
I only just wanted to add, let's not forget about politics. And I only mean to say that because it's a very important component when you have emerging technologies like this. What are the policies? How are they going to evolve and emerge? We have a new administration coming in with different ideas about some of these. So it's really important to sort of keep abreast and engage in policy discussions around things like AI, because it's going to make a big difference in the ability to sell it and market it in this environment.
Well said. Any other comments, Stacey, David? Not to put you on the spot.
I think some of the comments Stacey said around understanding the different stakeholders, especially the downstream stakeholders, is important. I also just wanted to mention really quickly, I think Stacey and we were chatting earlier, but I think Stacey and myself will both be at RSNA, I believe. So, and if anyone here is in the radiology space, I'd love to meet up at RSNA.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think this is such an exciting area of healthcare. The pace of innovation in AI and what it's going to be able to do and how it's going to be able to transform patient care is super exciting, and in ways that we have never thought about before. So I think, thinking about all these elements of it that can help you get to market and get adoption faster than you would otherwise is really important, because ultimately I think we're all here for the impact on the patient, right? That's really what this is all about. We're not building AI technology for technology's sake. We're building AI tools that can fundamentally change the life of a patient, and that's what gets me up every morning and working in this area.
Couldn't agree more. So with that, I will officially wrap our webinar today. Again, Laurel, Stacey, and David, thank you again so much for your time. And on behalf of PRIA Healthcare, we want to wish everyone a very pleasant rest of your day. If you have any persisting questions or would like more information, please feel free to reach out to PRIA, and we'd be happy to talk about your questions. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.